In movies, crossing the Wild West on horseback looks like a romantic adventure, but what Hollywood won't show you is the horrifying reality that killed 3 out of 5 riders who attempted these journeys. From flesh-eating diseases to brutal bandit attacks, these are the gruesome truths that most history books left out. Today, we're diving into the darkness of Wild West travel, and why most who attempted it never lived to tell their tale. What you're about to learn might change everything you thought you knew about surviving in the Old West. The bone-breaking journey. The physical toll of crossing the Wild West on horseback was a nightmare that few today could comprehend. Hour after hour, day after day, riders endured a relentless assault on their bodies that would make modern gym workouts feel like a gentle stretch. Imagine spending 12 hours straight bouncing on a wooden saddle, your spine compressing with each hoofbeat while the merciless sun bakes you from above. The reality was brutal. Saddle sores weren't just uncomfortable. They were deep, bleeding wounds that could become infected and potentially fatal in an era before antibiotics. Riders would stuff their pants with whatever soft material they could find, from grass to rabbit fur, desperately trying to create some cushioning between their raw skin and the unyielding leather. But the torture didn't end with saddle sores. The constant jarring motion gradually compressed riders' spines, leading to excruciating back pain that no amount of rest seemed to cure. Their hands would develop thick calluses from gripping the reins, often cracking and bleeding in the dry air. Joints, especially knees and hips, would swell from the repetitive motion, making every dismount an exercise in agony. Weather exposure amplified this suffering exponentially. With no modern moisture-wicking fabrics or waterproof gear, riders faced nature's fury with little more than cotton shirts and wool coats. Summer rides meant being cooked alive under layers of clothing necessary to prevent sunburn, while winter travels brought the bone-chilling agony of frozen fingers barely able to grip the reins. Many riders developed permanent injuries, their bodies forever marked by their time in the saddle. Nature's deadly arsenal. Nature in the Wild West wasn't just untamed, it was actively hostile to human survival. Every step through this unforgiving landscape was a gamble with death, where the smallest mistake could prove fatal. Rattlesnakes lurked beneath rocks and inside hollow logs, their venom capable of killing a grown man within hours. Scorpions infiltrated bedrolls and boots, delivering excruciating stings that could leave riders incapacitated for days. But the smaller threats paled in comparison to the apex predators that stalked the trails. Wolves hunted in packs, following riders for days, waiting for any sign of weakness. Their howls would echo through the night, a psychological torture that kept both horses and humans on edge. Grizzly bears, weighing up to 600 pounds, could appear without warning, capable of killing a horse with a single swipe of their massive paws. The weather itself was a relentless predator. Summer brought sudden thunderstorms that transformed dry creek beds into raging torrents within minutes, sweeping away unwary travelers. Winter blizzards would appear seemingly from nowhere, trapping riders in whiteouts where visibility dropped to mere feet. Temperatures could plummet so rapidly that exposed skin would freeze within minutes. Mountain lions were perhaps the most terrifying, known for their stealth and preference for attacking from behind. A rider might never know they were being stalked until it was too late. Even experienced frontiersmen told stories of finding half-eaten horses and shredded saddlebags, grim reminders that in the Wild West, humans were not at the top of the food chain. The water gamble. Water wasn't just scarce in the Wild West. Finding it could mean the difference between life and death. Rivers and streams shown on crude maps would often be dry by the time travelers reached them, forcing desperate searches for alternative water sources. Even when water was found, it wasn't always safe. Stagnant pools harbored deadly bacteria, while alkali water could sicken both horses and riders. Dehydration was a constant threat, creeping up slowly but relentlessly. A horse required 10 to 12 gallons daily just to survive, and carrying enough water between reliable sources was often impossible. Riders learned to read the landscape for signs of water, certain birds, green vegetation, or changes in terrain. But these signs could be deceptive, leading to deadly wild goose chases. Waterborne diseases were perhaps the most insidious threat. Giardia, typhoid, and cholera lurked in seemingly clean water sources. Boiling water wasn't always possible due to lack of firewood or time, forcing travelers to gamble with their health. Horses were particularly vulnerable, as they couldn't resist drinking from contaminated sources when thirsty. A sick horse meant certain death for both animal and rider if they were far from civilization. The worst was watching your horse suffer from dehydration, its coat becoming dull, its eyes sunken, its steps becoming increasingly unstable. Many riders faced the horrific choice of either mercy-killing their dying mount or leaving it behind to die slowly, knowing that doing so likely meant their own death as well. Hidden threats of the trail. Hidden threats of the trail made every step a potential disaster, even for the most experienced riders. Quicksand and marshlands didn't announce themselves with convenient signs. These deceptive grounds could swallow a horse and rider whole, leaving no trace for passing travelers to find. The worst quicksand pits looked like inviting stretches of firm, dry ground, until the surface broke and began pulling its victims under. Rock slides were another silent killer. The weight and movement of a horse could trigger devastating avalanches on mountain trails, sending tons of rocks cascading down without warning. Even small slides could spook horses, causing them to rear and throw their riders on treacherous paths where a fall meant certain death. Getting lost was perhaps the most terrifying hidden threat. Without reliable maps or landmarks, travelers could wander in circles for days. The landscape played cruel tricks on the mind. Every hill began to look the same. Every valley seemed familiar. Some riders would follow what they thought was their own trail, only to realize they'd been tracking themselves in circles as supplies dwindled. The worst part was the uncertainty. Every crossing of a riverbed could hide quicksand. Every narrow mountain pass could conceal unstable rocks. Every unfamiliar stretch of prairie could be the one where you lost your bearings. Experienced riders told of whole wagon trains disappearing into these hidden threats, leaving nothing but scattered belongings as mute testimony to the dangers that lurked just beneath the surface. The horse's breaking point. The horse's breaking point was a constant shadow looming over every journey. These noble animals, despite their strength, faced brutal challenges that often proved fatal. The scarcity of feed along established trails meant horses often had to survive on minimal grazing, their bodies slowly weakening as the miles stretched on. What grass they found was often sparse and nutrient-poor, barely enough to maintain their strength. Horse injuries were devastatingly common. A stone bruise could lead to lameness. A strained tendon could worsen until the horse couldn't walk. Saddle sores on horses were even more severe than those afflicting riders, as the animal had to bear both its own movement and the weight of its rider. These wounds could become infected, leading to a slow, agonizing decline. Without veterinary care, even minor injuries could become fatal. Colic, a common but serious digestive problem, often meant death for horses on the trail. A horse with a broken leg had to be shot, leaving its rider stranded in hostile territory. The harsh reality was that many riders carried a pistol not for protection against bandits, but to end their horse's suffering when the inevitable happened. The most heartbreaking aspect was watching a loyal mount deteriorate. Horses would work themselves to death for their riders, pushing through pain and exhaustion until they literally collapsed. Many seasoned travelers spoke of the gut-wrenching moment when they realized their horse had reached its breaking point, knowing there was nothing they could do to save their four-legged companion. Bandits and hostile encounters. Bandits and hostile encounters were a constant threat that turned every journey into a nerve-wracking gamble. Ambush points were predictable. Narrow canyons, river crossings, and mountain passes became killing grounds where outlaws could trap travelers with nowhere to run. These bandits weren't the romanticized figures from dime novels. They were desperate men who wouldn't hesitate to kill for a saddle or a few bullets. Night raids were particularly terrifying. Riders would wake to the sound of approaching hooves, with seconds to decide whether to fight, flee, or hide. Many travelers told of watching helplessly from hiding spots as raiders took their horses and supplies, knowing that reporting the crime was impossible and pursuit would be suicidal. Territorial disputes added another layer of danger. Native American tribes rightfully defended their lands, while cattle barons marked vast territories as their own through force. Crossing these invisible boundaries could trigger violent confrontations. Some areas were so notorious that riders would add days to their journey just to avoid them. The worst part was the uncertainty. Every distant dust cloud could be approaching raiders. Every rustle in the night brush could be bandits preparing to strike. Some riders resorted to traveling only at night, while others formed armed groups for protection. But strength in numbers also meant being more visible to those looking to prey on travelers. The isolation factor. The isolation of Wild West travel was a psychological torment that broke even the strongest minds. Weeks would pass without seeing another human face, forcing riders to grapple with the crushing loneliness that many found unbearable. The endless horizons and unchanging landscapes created a sense of being trapped in an infinite void. The lack of human contact wasn't just emotionally draining, it was dangerous. With no one to help in emergencies, no one to share watches during dangerous territories, and no one to assist if illness struck, isolation could be fatal. Some riders reported talking to their horses just to maintain their sanity, while others began having conversations with imaginary companions. Communication limitations amplified this isolation. Letters could take months to reach their destination, if they arrived at all. Family members often had no way of knowing if their loved ones were alive or dead. The uncertainty of not knowing what lay ahead, whether the next town still existed, whether trading posts were still operating, or whether planned meeting points would be honored, added to the psychological burden. Perhaps most haunting was the evidence of others who had succumbed to isolation. Riders would occasionally stumble upon abandoned camps, graves marked with crude crosses, or the sun-bleached bones of those who had died alone. These grim reminders drove home a terrifying reality. In the vastness of the Wild West, a person could vanish without a trace, their fate forever unknown to those who waited for their return. Supply chain nightmares. Supply chain nightmares made every journey a careful balancing act between survival and mobility. A horse could only carry about 150 pounds of supplies without compromising its stamina, forcing brutal decisions about what to bring. Essential items like ammunition often took precedence over food and medical supplies. Every pound had to be justified, and every item left behind could mean the difference between life and death. Food preservation was a constant struggle. Salt pork and hardtack were staples, but even these hearty foods could spoil in extreme temperatures. Game meat couldn't be preserved for long without salt, which itself was a precious commodity. Many riders subsisted on a monotonous diet that barely provided enough calories for survival. Equipment repairs posed another critical challenge. A broken stirrup or saddle could be catastrophic without access to a blacksmith. Riders had to become expert craftsmen, carrying basic tools and spare parts while learning to make repairs with whatever materials they could find. Some would salvage parts from abandoned equipment they found along the trail, grim reminders of those who hadn't made it. The strategic headaches were endless. Every item had to serve multiple purposes. Ammunition was needed for both protection and hunting. Spare horseshoes meant less room for food. Medical supplies might be sacrificed for essential repair tools. These decisions haunted riders when emergencies arose, forcing them to face the consequences of every ounce they'd chosen to leave behind. Disease and injury. Disease and injury in the Wild West often meant a slow, painful death. Without medical care for hundreds of miles, even minor wounds could become fatal. A simple cut could develop into gangrene within days. Broken bones, if they healed at all, often healed wrong, leaving riders permanently crippled. Snake bites and animal attacks frequently proved fatal, with victims suffering through agonizing final hours. Common trail injuries were especially dangerous. Falls from horses could shatter bones or cause internal bleeding. Crushing injuries from spooked horses or during river crossings often meant a lingering death. Even seemingly minor injuries like sprains could prevent riding, leaving travelers stranded in hostile territory. Infectious diseases were perhaps the deadliest threat. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery spread rapidly through camps and water sources. Without antibiotics, these diseases were often death sentences. Riders learned to avoid certain areas known for malaria or yellow fever, but sometimes taking these longer routes meant running out of supplies. The psychological impact of watching fellow travelers succumb to disease and injury was devastating. Many wrote in their journals about the helplessness of watching companions die slowly, unable to offer any meaningful assistance. Some Some riders carried morphine, not for themselves, but as a mercy for others who might suffer mortal wounds. This constant awareness of vulnerability, knowing that any day could bring an injury or illness that meant certain death, created a kind of fatalistic mindset among Wild West travelers. As one diary entry grimly noted, "Out here, it's not a question of if you'll face death, but when." The time factor. The time factor turned every journey into a deadly race against nature. Seasonal weather windows were brutally short. Starting too early meant facing spring floods and muddy trails that could trap horses. Starting too late risked early winter storms that could strand entire parties in mountain passes. These weather windows varied unpredictably, forcing travelers to gamble with their departure dates. Journey planning was a complex calculation of risk versus speed. A faster pace meant more strain on horses and higher risk of injury. A slower pace meant carrying more supplies and potentially missing the weather window. Some routes became completely impassable during certain seasons, forcing lengthy detours that could add weeks to travel time. Delays could be catastrophic. A lame horse, a washed-out trail, or a bandit attack could force travelers to stop long enough to miss their window of opportunity. Many found themselves trapped between equally deadly choices, pushing forward through dangerous conditions or waiting it out as supplies dwindled. The most experienced riders developed an almost supernatural awareness of time's passage, reading subtle changes in weather patterns, animal behavior, and vegetation to gauge the changing seasons. But even they could be caught off guard by the Wild West's unpredictable nature. As one pioneer's diary noted, "Time is the cruelest killer out here. Too fast, too slow. Either way, you're dead." Now you know why even the toughest frontiersmen feared these cross-country journeys.